American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Welcome everyone to our third session in American English Webinar Series 6, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. Let's start our session today with a great photo submitted by the American Corner Rangoon with their viewing group in Burma. We love to see our teachers learning and exchanging ideas during the webinars, as well as celebrating their successful completion of webinar series. Please share your webinar viewing group photos by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org. We may feature them in the next webinar. I'm Lauren Whitaker, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Lauren. You'll also see Moderator Katie S. in the chat box to help you during this webinar. We'll assist and support you as you participate. Here you can see the exciting schedule for this series. Our next Series 6 webinar, Global Topics, Local Teaching, will be in 2 weeks on June 14th and will be presented by Clark Irwin Bionis. Our webinars are each 60 minutes long. Webinars are often related to a theme found on the American English website. The Teacher's Corner section from the website shown here features resources and lesson ideas related to the month's topic. The theme for June is Building Global Citizens. Next, let's look at how you participate in the webinars. During these webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is by typing in the chat box, as many of you are already doing. The chat box is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over, the Ning Community for Teachers, which we'll look at in more detail momentarily. The presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. Some people may experience technical problems during the webinar. We will let you know if we are having a global problem. If you do lose sound, you can follow along with the caption pod at the bottom of the screen if refreshing your internet browser doesn't correct the problem. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars will take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy after the series ends. To ensure you are eligible for the e-certificate, we will ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, you will go to the internet link we provide so that you can submit the requested attendance information. We hope many of you are already on the Ning community, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join us. It may take up to 72 hours for your Ning registration to be approved, especially at the beginning of a new series. Here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings and featured materials. The Ning is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar and live chat with fellow community members. Before I introduce our webinar for today, I'd also like to encourage you to check out this week's Teacher Corner on americanenglish.state.gov. Learn how to use comic strip activities in the classroom to help your students develop critical thinking and language skills. This activity is simple and fun, and it can be used with any group at any level. And now for today's webinar, Beyond Proficiency, Nurturing Critical Thinking Skills in the EFL Classroom. Combining communicative English language teaching approaches with activities requires students to think critically and can create a dynamic, productive learning environment. During this webinar, the presenter will examine why teachers should devote time to helping students develop a critical thinking mindset, both for language acquisition and lifelong learning purposes, in addition to sharing practical ideas for promoting critical thinking in the EFL classroom. It is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Heather Benucci, also known as Moderator Heather. Heather Benucci is an EFL teacher, teacher trainer, and materials development specialist. She has led virtual professional development programs for EFL teachers from over 100 countries. Heather has also served as a U.S. Department of State English language specialist for projects related to academic writing in Russia and online professional development in Brazil. Heather holds master's degrees in TESOL and international relations with an emphasis on intercultural communication. In her free time, Heather loves to enjoy the outdoors in the beautiful state of Alaska. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you for that introduction, Lauren. I appreciate it. And hello to all of you teachers around the world. I am always so excited to be here with you, learning and growing. So today we are going to be talking about critical thinking again for the third webinar in this series. And I do want to point out one word before we jump in, which is nurturing in the title, Beyond Proficiency, Nurturing Critical Thinking. For those of you who might be experiencing that word for the first time, that is supporting or helping to grow or develop. So we are going to be talking about helping our students grow their critical thinking skills. And to do that, we are first going to develop a shared understanding of what it means to think critically. Then we're going to take a look at some reasons why it's important to teach critical thinking skills in the English language classroom. And then we're going to look at how to do that, both as a teacher in terms of our role in creating an environment to support critical thinking, as well as some ideas for practical classroom activities. Okay, before we jump in, I'd like to do an activity with you all. So you're going to see a quote on the left-hand side, and this quote says, "Our reliance on texting has damaged our ability to have important face-to-face conversations, such as making apologies or saying congratulations or thank you." So I'd like you to react to that quote. You have 7 options there on the right-hand side. Take a moment and read all of the options before you make your final selection. There's some fine shades of meaning here. So option 1 would be, I'm not interested in this topic. 2, I agree, it's true. 3, I disagree, it's false. 4, I'm not sure. 5, I agree up to a point, but I also disagree. 6, I agree or disagree because. And 7, I agree or disagree for a number of reasons, but I also want to see more evidence related to this topic. So take one more second here to enter your final answer about our reliance on texting has damaged our ability to have important face-to-face conversations. Okay, so make note of your answer and see where it falls on this scale. So if you said answer 1 from a critical thinking perspective and an active participation in class, again, if we were thinking about doing this with our students' perspective, you don't have to be interested in every topic that comes up, but try to form a position or take a stance when you're asked. If you answered 2 or 3 and said, I agree, it's true, or disagree, it's false, okay, good. You had a strong opinion, but can you give some reasons for your opinion? For answers 4 and 5, those are both safe choices, basically like, I'm not so sure here. But critical thinkers need to be active in discussions, and that usually means picking a side. And if you picked 6, I agree or disagree because, great, that means you have reasons or evidence behind your opinion. And 7, excellent. Not only do you have an opinion, you want to find out some more information about this topic maybe before you make your final decision. So this is just to get us thinking about critical thinking, and also this can be a great activity to use with your class if you are having some trouble with critical thinking in discussions, for example. You can use this activity as a way to set some expectations for what you would like to see from your students in terms of depth and format of answer. All right, let's go back to the presentation. And next, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit more work. In the chat box, what I would like to see, please, is your definition of critical thinking. It can be sort of an unclear or nebulous term with several different interpretations out there. I would like to know what you think it means. How would you define it? And while you all are sharing your ideas, I wanted to put up a couple of ideas that came across on the Ning in our pre-webinar discussion from a few participants around the world in Saudi Arabia, Uruguay, and Indonesia. Feel free to take a look at these great contributions as well. So I see lots of things coming in. I see critical thinking as having your own opinion, analyzing the idea, hearing other opinions. I like that. The ability to express your opinion. Let's see. Valeria says questioning, establish things and ideas. Responding, developing, and okay, great. Lots of good ideas here. Let's see if we can refine this definition a little bit more with the help of some outside opinions. So John Hughes, in his pamphlet, Critical Thinking in the Language Classroom, which will be available to you all on the Ning, says that at a basic level, critical thinking is about finding out whether is something true, is true, partly true, or not true at all. So we're fact-finding, we're looking for evidence and truth. And taking it a bit further, Stephen Schaefersman, in his article, An Introduction to Critical Thinking, also available to you on the Ning, says critical thinking is the pursuit of relevant and reliable knowledge about the world. It's reasonable, reflective, responsible, and skillful. So I like to focus on that word skillful. It's something that can be learned and practiced. And this type of thinking is focused on what to believe or what to do. So forming opinions or taking action. And Schaefersman offers another helpful analogy, for me anyway. I like to think about critical thinking as a process, as he says, that is similar to the applying the scientific method by ordinary people to the ordinary world. So you might need to think back to primary school or secondary school science class and refresh your memory of the scientific method, but these concepts can be applied to everyday situations. So in the scientific method, you define your question or the issue of interest. You develop a hypothesis or hypotheses, educated guesses based on your existing background knowledge and what you already understand about the issue. Then you go out and you collect data, information, and evidence. You analyze and evaluate the quality of that information. And then you draw a reasoned, thoughtful conclusion, and you reflect on the process of how you reached that conclusion. So while this is drawn from the sciences, I think it is a great way to think about critical thinking and how we can help our students through the process of thinking more critically in the classroom. Okay, now that we have a bit clearer idea what we mean when we say critical thinking, I'd like to look at two different models that classify critical thinking skills. Many of you are probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Raise your hand if you've heard of Bloom's taxonomy before. Great, I see quite a few hands going up. It might be new to some of you, and that's okay. This system for classifying thinking skills was developed by Benjamin Bloom and his team in the 1950s, and it was updated around the year 2000 by Lauren Anderson and David Kretwall. And it is usually showing skills from lower order thinking skills at the bottom to higher order thinking skills at the top. So less complex up to more complex. And the diagram is usually shown as a pyramid, but since I am up in Alaska, I wanted to show you this lovely picture of Mount Foraker in Alaska. So let's start at the bottom of the pyramid, or bottom of the mountain. And that is remembering. That's the ability to locate information and recall details from some sort of text that you've interacted with or some type of content that you've interacted with. Moving up in complexity is the understanding, and that is being able to organize facts and ideas or explain the ideas and concepts in that content. And then it's taking that information that you've understood and applying it to do something different. And we do a lot of application activities in the language classroom, right? We do true and false, comprehension, fill in the blank, complete the chart, those types of things where we're asking students to demonstrate through application their understanding. Next in complexity, we have analysis, and that is breaking apart a whole. That's looking at a part and how they looking at the parts of something and how they relate to each other. Really taking a close look at how something is structured, and we do this a lot when we analyze texts in terms of how they are built and put together. And then we get into evaluation, and this is looking at the quality, the validity, the reliability of arguments, information, and how it is organized. This is where we start making some judgments about the information. And according to Bloom's taxonomy, sort of the pinnacle, the top of the mountain here is creation. Taking this information that you have analyzed and evaluated and coming up with something new, and that could be new thoughts and ideas, a new product, maybe you're developing something in the class like a role play or a poster project, or you might be just developing a solution to a challenging problem or situation. So these steps are not sequential. It's not that every time in class we need to go from remembering up to creation to have a successful critical thinking skills-oriented lesson. And you might actually be doing some of these at the same time. You might be skipping around among these steps, but this is just meant to, again, show that progression from less complex to more complex thinking skills. And another model that you might be less familiar with is presented by Peter Faccione. And he shares 6 cognitive skills, so 6 thinking skills of strong critical thinkers. And we just looked at Bloom's taxonomy here, and I think you'll see that Faccione's model relates in many ways. So at the bottom he has interpret, and that skill relates to, I would say, 3 of the Bloom's taxonomy categories: remembering, understanding, and applying. He also has analyze and evaluate, same. And then he has 2 skills that I think are related to this idea of create in Bloom's taxonomy. And first is inference, being able to take information you've analyzed and evaluated and to draw reasonable conclusions from it. And also explaining, so not just being able to reach a decision, but being able to explain to somebody else how you reached that decision and then to justify your conclusions. And last but not least, a unique part of his model is this idea of self-regulation. And this is evaluating our own thinking. Some of you might have heard of metacognition, or thinking about your own thinking. And this is looking at the quality of our thought, taking the time when we reach a decision or come up with that new thing, and reflect back on how we got there and look for weaknesses in our thought process. And this is a skill we can support in our learners, and we'll look at some specific strategies as we progress through the webinar today. Okay, time for you all to stop and think again. So we've defined critical thinking, and we've looked at 2 models for some skills associated with critical thinking. Now I'd like to ask you, what makes critical thinking difficult? Why is it hard? What are some challenges? Okay, some skills need to be developed. Yes, definitely. It involves practice, lots of practice. The time we teachers have for each lesson. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a bit later. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's see. Language barriers for second language learners. That's a real challenge. Great, RB. I see Sunny says lack of vocabulary. Yep, that's definitely a challenge for language learner. Okay, great. Yes, lots of roadblocks and challenges to critical thinking in the classroom and to the process itself of critical thought. 2 that I'd like to talk about are biases and assumptions. These are habits of the mind, shortcuts, if you will, that our brains take in order to make it through every day. It would be challenging to stop and do a full critical thinking process for every situation you encounter throughout a single day. So our brain develops these habits, and sometimes they can get in our way. So a bias is a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment, and it can be considered prejudice either for something or against something. And then we have assumptions, and these are the things that we just believe are true or certain. And a lot of times we haven't thought through why we think they're true, and we haven't looked at proof. So these two things, again, we cannot avoid them, but they are hurdles that we have to actively overcome when we are trying to think critically. So we're going to take a poll here because I want to remind us we are not robots. We cannot automatically think with precision through everything in our day and through all of our aspects in our language classes. So what are some things that might shape and influence our assumptions and biases? You can choose as many of these as you'd like. It might be our family and who we know, our cultures, where we work, where we live. Do we live in the city? Do we live in the country? Our past experiences, people or organizations of authority in our lives, where we get our information. Maybe we have preferred newspapers, preferred social media inputs, preferred radio stations we listen to, and maybe some other things as well. Great, I see answers coming in for almost every single thing. The most popular seems to be our culture, who we know, our past experiences are right. Let's go back to the presentation, please. I agree with you. I think all of these things can contribute to the development of assumptions and biases. As I said, we are human and we can't avoid them. But we do, as critical thinkers and as our students, in terms of encouraging critical thinking, we need to be aware of our own assumptions and biases so we can try to suspend them, put them on hold, and see things through a fresh set of eyes. And again, this is a skill we can practice. Okay, let's wrap up our conversation here about defining critical thinking. Critical thinking requires curiosity, it requires questioning, and it is a process that's designed to help you do or think something based on evidence that you've analyzed and evaluated. It can be learned in practice. It is a skill, and it looks at all sides of a problem, and it helps us also to be more aware of our own thinking, how we form opinions, what our biases and assumptions might be. All right. So we know what critical thinking is, at least for our purposes today. Now we need to turn our attention to why bother with it in the EFL classroom. And I am going to present 3 different reasons why I think it's an important skill to emphasize in the EFL classroom. And the first of which is 21st century skills. That's a term that gets kicked around, gets said a lot. What do you all think that means? What are some examples of 21st century skills? Great, I see some answers coming in the chat. Collaboration, innovation, communication. Ahmed says leadership. Basad says group work. Working across cultures, that's a great example. I see Real Mexico, their group says technical literacy, creativity, empathy, teamwork. Super. These are actually all examples of in-demand 21st century skills. And I did notice a lot of the things that are coming into the chat relate to communication and information awareness. And I would argue that our 21st century students and ourselves, we also experience information overload, whether it is social media, the 24-hour news cycle, online information. We are constantly receiving information. But how do we know what's useful and reliable information and what isn't? So in their book, Digital Literacies, Dudney, Hockley, and Pegram identify several types of literacy that our students need to have to be successful in the 21st century. And they use 2 terms to cover the same concept, information literacy and critical literacy. And this type of literacy has to do with sorting through information, evaluating it through critical questioning, figuring out if the information we're looking at is credible. How many of you have had a student out there that just turns in things from Wikipedia or I found it on Google? We need to be able to help our students go past some of those shallow approaches to you being consumers of information and comparing sources and trying to find out where information is coming from. Are those sources reliable? So even though it's not directly necessarily a language skill, these are skills I think all educators have an obligation to try to help our students with. Okay, reason number 2 for EFL classes addressing critical thinking skills, and these have to do with effective and interpersonal skills. Can anyone help me out in the chat box and let me know, what does effective mean? What's an effective skill? Emotions, exactly. I see Zainab and Dilafruz say emotions, things to do with our feelings and our emotions. So critical thinkers are usually curious. As we said, you want to know, you have to have that questioning mindset. Critical thinkers are also usually intellectually humble, and by this I mean critical thinkers are not afraid to say, I don't know. But they don't see that as the end of the road. They see that as the challenge, and that is the persistence aspect. It is seeing a gap in knowledge or maybe some uncertainty about knowledge, and then being willing to put in the hard work to figure out what information is helpful and what your final decision or product is going to be. And the ability to do that and to know why you think what you think leads to confidence. And as you practice these skills with critical thinking, you are having, as we just saw, to look at our own biases and assumptions and to put yourself in someone else's shoes, as the saying goes, which means to think about things from other perspectives. And this helps you be both tolerant of others and open-minded. And that gets into some of the things that I think we English teachers are very concerned about, and that is being good intercultural communicators. So I would like to see if you think these are important skills to support or in the classroom. If you do, raise your hand. Okay, great. I see lots of hands going up. I know I would like to have a classroom of students that I could help achieve these types of skills. All right, last but not least, in terms of why critical thinking in the EFL classroom, I'd like to talk about academic and language skills, sort of the meat, the important part of what we do according to most people. And for those of you out there, and I believe it is most of you who subscribe to communicative language teaching, it requires authentic communication, and that means bringing in situations that students might face in the real world. And a lot of times, to have that dynamic interaction in the classroom, we have students cooperating, whether it's pair work, group work, things like that. So a core part of communicative language teaching involves working together to talk about real life things. Also, we language teachers need to be able to support our students as they express their opinions and make arguments, and we can provide them the language that's needed to be able to do that well. And students, as part of that 21st century skill, that idea of information or critical literacy, need to be able to interpret and read between the lines, as you might say, what a text is doing. And that means sometimes language is used to persuade or mislead. Can we help them recognize the cues? And we'll look at an example of how to do this towards the end of the webinar. But can we help them interpret that information? And a lot of that is language skill based. And again, not very fun or exciting, but critical thinking skills are assessed, if not directly, indirectly, by standardized exams. Any exam that asks a student to write a pro-con essay, a persuasive essay, an opinion essay, they are being evaluated on their ability to make an argument in a logical order using evidence to support their opinions. And these skills are essential for university success, depending on which students you teach. This might be an important goal for them. Professors and instructors expect students to be able to debate ideas, to interact with their other students, and to use evidence and make arguments. Excuse me. Okay, so what does that mean for us as teachers? Some of you out there might be saying, all right, that's all well and good, Heather, but my students aren't very good at critical thinking. I think we might need to jump back to the beginning where we said critical thinking, it's a skill. And if it's a skill, it's something that can be learned and practiced. And if that's the case, that's what we're good at, right? We're great at teaching. So what can I do to help my students become better critical thinkers? So let's not think about it as my students aren't very good at critical thinking. Let's think about what we can do to help them become great critical thinkers. All right, so let's look at our role. one of the first things we can do is to learn more about critical thinking, really thinking about what it means. And you guys are all doing that today here. We're learning together, so pat yourselves on the back or give yourselves a round of applause for extending your professional development in this category. We can also create an environment that supports, that nurtures critical thinkers, questioning, and curiosity. And as we design our courses and lessons, we can proactively plan to include critical thinking components. So let's take a closer look at these last two items. We're going to think about a couple of reflective questions while we think about the teacher's role in terms of attitude and building class community. So a question to ask yourself is, do I give my students a chance to think deeply when I ask them a question? Okay, what is one thing you can do to give students a chance to think critically when you ask a question? And I'll give you a hint. You might want to go back to webinar 6.1 with Kevin, who talked about some of the habits of teacher talk. Great. I see several of you are saying time. Increase teacher wait time. That's a great thing we can do in terms of community building and supportive environment in the language classroom, is give students time to process what's being asked, to form an opinion, to activate the language they need to express themselves, and then speak. And avoiding some of those other unfortunate teacher talk habits can also assist on this front. So we saw that great video with Kevin of the self-answerer. Anyone? If you didn't get a chance to see it, please go to the Ning and review that webinar. It was a lot of great information. Okay. Another question you can ask yourself is, do I use my language and my attitude to encourage the students to be questioners? Do I invite debate? Do I invite different views? And do I, again, encourage curiosity? And you can use specific language to do this. And here's an example. You might say in response to a student, "Oh, great question. I bet a lot of people are curious about that," and then turn the discussion back to the class. Can you all in the chat box share any other examples of language you as a teacher might use to encourage questioning, debates, different views, differing opinions? I see some people saying Socratic method, use open questions. What are some other things? Yep, praise, well done. You hit the point. Good job. What do you think? Yeah. Oh, yep. Excellent. Let's see. Okay, let's look at a few more examples. You might tell someone, good point. I saw that come up in the chat box there. Tell me more. Get at that deeper thought. Tell me more. If somebody gives you a surface level, a basic answer, ask them to tell you more. And maybe you don't agree with what a student is saying. We don't want to cut them off, right? We don't want to say, oh, no, that's wrong. We might say, oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. What do other people think? Invite some other responses. And then we can also ask, oh, excuse me, it sounds like an airplane. It's going right over my house. I apologize for that background noise. We can also ask people to respond to others. I want to draw your attention to this last one, though. This can be scary for teachers to say, as a teacher, I don't know. I'm not sure. But to not leave it there. Ask the class, ask your students, how can we find out? Make it a challenge. Show that you, the teacher, are curious and that you want to find the answers and think critically. So this is what we call walk the walk. Be a model for the behavior that you want to see in your students by showing them you're not afraid to go out and find an answer and think critically when you run into a challenge. Okay, and now we're going to talk a bit more about planning for critical thinking. So asking yourself, do I design objectives and activities that encourage students to think critically? And by this, I want to say that we don't need to write an explicit lesson plan that today, class, we're going to talk about critical thinking and how to do it. That can be fun and it can be appropriate for some types of students, but we can find ways to weave, to intersperse critical thinking goals in with our regular language goals. And we can do that by building objectives that take into account some of those skills we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. And those can be drawn from Bloom's Taxonomy or Faccione's Cognitive Skills of Strong Critical Thinkers. And there's a couple of ways you can use these tools. Some teachers like to have a poster on the wall, and they can direct students to that, or they can direct themselves to that as they're writing objectives. Some people put a printout of other verbs associated with these skills on their desk as memory joggers or cues as they're writing objectives to be sure to also include critical thinking skills. So let's take a look at what some objectives might look like. Students will be able to, okay, that's our common objective starter, perhaps use a graphic organizer to identify main ideas and supporting details. That's something we do a lot, I'm sure, in the language classroom. But it also involves the skill of applying and to some extent analysis. We might ask students to identify how an author uses adjectives and adverbs to achieve a certain effect. So now we're combining language analysis with greater a sense of analysis and evaluation. And you can ask students to provide specific evidence and to support their response. This could be part of creation, explaining. And you might get specific. You might ask students to identify biases and assumptions in relation to a text or a topic that they're doing a project on. So critical thinking does not need to be taught in isolation. You can combine these skills with your existing language objectives if you put a little thought into it yourself. Okay, another thing on this front is using question starters. And question starters look like this. This is a handout that is taken from Shaping the Way We Teach English, Successful Practices from Around the World, which is an American English product. And it has a list of questions related to different critical thinking skills that you can put in your lesson plan. So for example, if you are focusing on an objective related to making inferences from a text, you can use these questions. You can write them directly into your lesson plan so you don't forget to ask them to your students during the lesson. So a good way to kind of cheat or, again, give yourself a little hint in your own lesson planning to make sure you're asking students to think more deeply. Again, this handout will be available for you on the name. And also on the front of designing objectives and activities, just the simple act of making sure that projects and activities relate to those real-world topics and incorporate student interests. That means they are going to be curious. They're going to want to find out more if it's things that directly relate to their lives and to their interests. Okay, so we have reached the third section of our webinar. We have talked about what critical thinking is, and we've talked about why it's a good fit for the EFL classroom. Now we are going to talk about how we can do that. And we're going to talk about some general tips, and then we're going to look at a couple of specific activities in the time that we have left together. So one of the easiest things you can do to encourage critical thinking with your students is to ask open-ended questions. And to check our understanding of what an open-ended question is, I'd like to move to a poll. Okay, so I have several questions here for you. What I would like you to do is to put a check next to the ones that you think are open-ended questions, and you can choose more than one. So we have, what is the main character's name? What's the past tense of sleep? If you could have dinner with any famous person, who would it be and why? What's the author's point of view on this topic? In what year did a man first walk on the moon? Do you like to play football? And based on the headline, what will this article be about? Let's take a few more seconds and pick any of the questions that you think are open-ended. Right now, it looks like the leaders are question C, question D, and pretty close between G and a lot of responses for A. Okay, so let's think about this. Open-ended questions require people to draw on their past knowledge, some of their feelings, their opinions, or perhaps evidence that's available. They're usually going to be a bit lengthier in terms of how they are answered. A closed question is usually going to invite a very short response. Yes, no, blue, slept, 1492. They don't require your students to do much thinking. So for these questions, I agree, if asking the main character's name probably not going to is not going to be an open-ended question. There's usually one short right answer, and the same for question B. Question C and D invite a variety of opinions and a little bit deeper thinking. So those are going to be open-ended questions. E is asking for a specific fact with a single answer. That's going to be closed. Do you like to play football? You might get a variety of answers, but the answer is probably just going to be yes, no. So I would call that a closed question. And then the last one, based on the headline, what will this article be about? That's a prediction question. And students might have a variety of answers, and those answers can involve a lot of critical and creative thinking. All right, let's go back to the presentation. So beyond asking open-ended questions, in our last webinar, webinar 6.2, with Bruce Rubin, we talked about image analysis. And a lot of Bruce's examples were for perhaps more advanced or older learners. A lot of great information there. Again, I encourage you to go to the Ning and check that webinar out if you weren't able to participate. What I want to show you now is this concept can also be used with young learners, beginner learners, pre-literate learners, so other audiences apart from maybe older or more advanced learners. So let's pretend this picture here is in a textbook or maybe a storybook, and it has a basic sentence associated with it. Matthew likes to ice skate in the winter. Okay, well, if you read that aloud to your students, you've provided them with linguistic input. Well and good. But you can also turn this basic image into a critical thinking exercise by asking them to provide you some examples and evidence and make predictions based on what they see. So you might start out with a fairly closed question. Is it hot or is it cold? What do you think the weather is? Okay, and you might get a response, cold. Well, why? What do you see? Why do you think it's cold? And then you might get some great answers. So for example, my son is 1 year old. While English is his first language, I am always amazed at how much he has to say to questions like this. What do you see? How do you know? He would tell me things like hat, boy, warmer. Warmer is what he calls a scarf. Again, I see somebody saying things like, there's no leaves on the trees. There's a snowman. It's snowing. You can get a variety of answers and really get students giving you that evidence to answer or to back up their answer to a fairly simple question. And then you can turn it into predictions. What will the boy do next? You might say ice skating. People see the ice skates. Oh, he might go play with a snowman, go down the hill. Infinite number of answers, but getting students to think about what might not happen next. And then provide evidence for that prediction. Why do you think that? What do you see? How do you know? Great, I see somebody asking questions. Do you think he's happy? Why? Students might say, oh, he's smiling. He looks so happy. So again, from a very simple illustration, even with younger or beginner learners, you can draw out a lot of critical thinking. Okay, so let's move to something that is for slightly older students, maybe upper primary and above all the way to university and adult learners. These are KWL charts. Can you raise your hand if you have heard of KWL charts before? Great. Familiar concept for many, but probably new to many as well. So these are charts that we use before a student engages with a text. And this text can be either audio or text, actual a reading text. So before the student engages with the text, they would fill out the first column on the right, the K. This is what I already know about this topic. And they'd fill out the W. This is what I want to know after I engage with this text. So 2 columns would be filled out, and then after they do the reading and maybe do some comprehension checks or discuss with a partner, they would fill out the L column, what I learned as a result of reading or listening to the text. So this in and of itself is a great critical thinking skills support. You're asking students to draw on existing knowledge and to make some predictions and then to reflect on what they learned. But you can take this a step further by asking them for evidence. You can make it a KWLE chart with examples where they have to list evidence from the text that supports what they learned. Or maybe a KWLH chart, how I know what I learned. just adding one more aspect on of critical thinking to a fairly familiar way of having students interact with the text. And you can even go one more step further into that self-regulation skill that Faccione mentioned, which is thinking about our thinking, and asking students to go back and review the chart, especially the K column, and asking them about assumptions. Did you jump to any conclusions before you did the reading? So one more level of critical thinking by asking students to think about their thinking. Okay, now we're going to do some analysis and evaluation. And this has to do with analyzing a text. And this text I wrote I'm about my city, Anchorage, where I live in Alaska, and it could be a type of text that maybe you would see in a tourist brochure or online in a Visit My City type of a website. Realistic text that your students might interact with. And here we want students to think about determining fact versus opinion. Again, that 21st century skill of information literacy. What is a fact and what is the author perhaps trying to persuade you to think? So we might have students go through and underline opinions. Alas, Anchorage has the best food in the state. Everyone will love its cultural activities. It has the most beautiful parks. The coffee roasted in Anchorage is delicious. And then you can ask the students, from a language analysis perspective, to circle the words that tell them that these statements are opinions and not facts. So can anyone point out a word in these underlined statements that could be a clue as to why they are opinions? Okay, I see Tahani says best. Great. The most, says Una Franz. Perfect. You could have these students mark all these words up and then talk about them. Oh, these are all maybe superlatives or strong adjectives. And those can be cues for your students to help distinguish opinion versus fact. So in this type of activity, you're combining very clear language goals with critical thinking goals as well. Okay, on to our last activity. And this is called the Great Mini Debate. Mini in this case just means a little debate, not necessarily a big, long debate or a full panel debate. We're going to look at the details together. Before we get into the specifics of how to do this activity, I'd like to ask you why debating can be a good critical thinking skills activity for the language classroom. Go ahead and share your ideas in the chat box. Why is debating a good idea to encourage critical thinking? I see Gia Leong says you have to defend yourself in your positions. Exchanging opinions, great in Real Mexico. Expressing opinions. Students will be active, not passive. Definitely. Great. A chance to think in different points of view. Wonderful reasons. Okay. So this activity I wrote, it's in English Teaching Forum in the current online version of the journal in the section called Try This, which is usually a classroom-oriented activity. And this activity is designed for upper intermediate students, but you can also adapt it some depending on your student's level, and we'll talk about how in just a second. The goals of this activity is for students to present an oral argument using evidence and to also use functional language, and that's going to relate to debate functions such as agreeing, disagreeing, or showing a difference of opinion. And this is a great activity from a logistics or preparation standpoint in that you don't need very many materials. Teachers, you just need something to write with and a place to write, so a blackboard or a whiteboard and some markers or chalk. Students need pencil or pens and some paper, and then you need a timing device. Okay, so for your preparation teachers, you're going to need to pick a theme for your debate. And you can pick any theme that interests your students or is relevant to what they're studying. In this case, I've chosen the debate theme of digital communication and social media. And then once you have your theme, you need to make a set of maybe 4 or 5 topics that relate to the theme. And each of those topics should be a statement that students are going to have very strong but probably differing opinions about. So here are some examples. This topic set includes statements like social media is mostly used for trivial or unimportant purposes. Texting's better than email or writing letters by hand. Or you might recognize this statement, the last one here. Our reliance on texting has damaged our ability to have important face-to-face conversations. That's what we used in our activity to open the webinar. And you all had very strong opinions about that statement. So you develop your topic set, and then when you come together with your class, you're going to do the standard things you would do as you prepare for an activity, such as activating their background knowledge and doing some vocabulary preparation. So you might ask students if they've ever seen a debate, what are some good qualities of a good debater, and you're going to write their ideas on the board. Then you're going to talk about some of the skills that you need to have to be a strong debater, such as agreeing, disagreeing, showing differences of opinion. And you can get the students to give you this language as much as possible by creating what's called, in the article, a functional language chart that looks like this. On the board, you can draw a column for agreeing, disagreeing, and showing difference of opinion. And then you can get students to give you examples of each of these things, and you can help them fill in any gaps they might have. So a completed functional language chart might look something like this. Okay, and we'll just take a closer look at the disagreeing column here. So maybe students have come up with examples like, oh, I'm sorry, but I can't agree with that, or that's not how I see the situation, or the facts don't support that position. So this is the type of thing that we're trying to elicit from our students. And to add on some more critical thinking, I would encourage you, for most of these, if you add the word because to them, you're going to have the students able not only to have a functional language ability in terms of agreeing or disagreeing or contrasting opinions, but they're going to have to immediately explain why, give some reasons, give some evidence. So to carry on with the activity, you tell the students they're going to get ready to do some debating, and you're going to form groups. There are a few ideas in the article for how to do that, and there are some tips for working with very large classes of more than 50 students. So don't worry, it doesn't matter if you have a big class, you can still do this activity. And then for each group, you need to have either a volunteer or a selected leader. And within the groups, the students are going to vote on the topic within the set that interests them the most. So an element of student choice. Again, students are going to be more excited about things that are interesting to them. And then you're going to ask students, in this case again, we're going to pretend students voted for our go-to statement here, reliance on texting has damaged our ability to have face-to-face conversations. And then we're going to ask the group members to think about their opinion in relation to the statement and then to line up in accordance to their level of agreement. So maybe you have one side of the room that is the I agree completely side, and I have the I disagree completely side on the other side of the room, and people in the middle are somewhere in between. So they'll have to do some talking to make this happen, which is always a good thing in the English language classroom. And then you're going to divide the line roughly in half. And the team that is closest to the agree completely side becomes team 4, and then the other side begins team against for your issue. Next, we enter the preparation phase, and this I've estimated is going to be about 20 minutes. It might vary a little bit depending on your student's level. So there'll be several teams around the room, possibly debating different topics, but we're just going to look at one group here. And they will get into their smaller groups here, team 4, team against, and they'll still be able to see those scaffolds, those supports on the board that you did at the beginning of the activity, the functional language chart and the list of good debater qualities. And so the group leader is going to keep them on time as they go through these stages. About 10 minutes of brainstorming, evidence and examples to support their position, and then 5 minutes of group discussion to pick which pieces of evidence are the best. They're going to do some evaluation, looking at the quality of the evidence that they've developed together. And then they're going to spend about 5 minutes thinking about the other team. What arguments might they make, and how are they going to defend against them? So students can make notes throughout this process, and they can take their notes with them as an extra support if needed to the next stage of the activity, and this is the actual mini debate. We're going to have students line up facing each other, one person from each team in the line, and they are going to do a debate for 1 or 2 minutes about their given topic, taking turns speaking, using that functional language from the functional language chart. And then after that 1-minute debate, the teacher will stop the time, and team against is going to stay still. But everybody in team 4 is going to take one step to the right in this case, and the person on the end on the right side is going to walk around to the last position to fill in the gap. And then the students will do another mini debate for a minute or two. Again, practicing some of their evidence. Maybe they change their arguments a little bit based on the last iteration or round of the debate. But you can do this as many times as you think is helpful for your students. And you, the teacher, can be monitoring their language and some of their debating skills while each mini debate is happening. So once you've done several rounds, and again, everybody's had a chance to talk, lots of student talking time several times, you're going to bring everybody back together for a group discussion. And you're going to ask the students to maybe identify some of the best arguments that they heard during the debates. Again, more evaluation and reflection. As a teacher, you can guide them through a discussion of any issues that you observed in terms of language use. And then you can ask students to do a bit more reflection. Did the debates become easier or harder as they did each round, and why might that be? So that is one option for running the great mini debate process. But I'm going to offer you one alternative idea, an extension, and that is to have students do all of the same steps, get in their line related to their topic about on their level of agreement, and then switch it on them. The people that are on the I agree completely side they're going to be the against team, and the people that are on the I disagree side are going to be the for team. And why might we do this? I think there's a great quote here at the bottom that is attributed to Aristotle. It's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. That means sometimes in order to be a good thinker, you have to contemplate the other's view. So again, one quick and easy way you can add even a deeper level of critical thinking skill to this activity. All right, we are reaching the end of our time together. I hope as we review our objectives, you feel like we've made some progress on these topics. We have talked about what it means to think critically together. We have thought about why critical thinking skills, whether it is direct instruction or just incorporating these skills into our EFL objectives, have a place in the language classroom. And we've also looked at some things we can do as teachers to create an environment and plan activities and objectives that have a critical thinking skills component. And we've looked at some specific ideas that you can apply in your classrooms. So I'm going to leave you with this thought as we close about the idea that in the end, no matter what subject we teach, our goal as teachers, at least in my belief, is to build and support lifelong learners. We want our students to think that their ideas matter, and we should teach that way. We should help them and ask them to make connections and recognize patterns. And if we do that, they're going to start experiencing responsibility for their own education, and they're going to think about what they learn and read. And students are going to feel involved in their own learning, they're going to feel deeply about it, and they're going to learn to value and trust their own thoughts and ideas. And that is drawn from Schaefersman as well. That article is going to be there for you on the Ning. The sources are here for you as well if you want to do any more research and look for your own evidence about critical thinking. And with that, I want to say a big thank you. I've enjoyed our time together, and I've appreciated your thoughtful contributions in the chats and in the polls and activities. So I look forward to learning with you on the Ning, and thank you for attending today.
Thank you, Heather, for sharing those excellent ideas for nurturing critical thinking skills in the EFL classroom. You helped us to better understand what it means to think critically and provided great practical ideas for promoting critical thinking in the classroom. We look forward to the post-webinar discussion and to exploring your Ning resource page. And we'd also like to thank you, our audience, for your active participation today. We look forward to learning with you again in 2 weeks on June 14th when Clark Irwin Biones will help us to better understand how to develop service learning activities in the classroom.